Okay, so as a result of last week's lectures, we now know everything there is to know about the evolution of behavior. And we know the drawbacks, and we know this stuff by now. And just reflexively, I have to say, we know about our three great pillars of modern selection: individual selection, kin selection, reciprocal altruism. Don't forget green beards, and don't forget that group selection, neo-group selection, snuck its way back in a way that is incredibly interesting and will be really very relevant to humans. So that's great. There's some sort of leftover question from all of this, though. Kin selection is obviously at the very heart of all of that stuff. Animal species that are obsessed with kinship, human cultures that are. How do you know who is a kin? How do you know who is a relative, let alone, two brothers, eight cousins, degree of relatedness? How do you know? This is obviously important. For one thing, it tells you who you're supposed to be maternal to. If you've just given birth, it tells you who you're supposed to be maternal to if somebody or other has just pecked their way out of an egg. And the fact that that doesn't work perfectly in some bird species is seen in the fact that there's other bird species, and I'm forgetting which ones it is, that could sneak their eggs into somebody else's nest so that the other one puts in all the energy raising your kid while you can go have another clutch. You really need to be able to know who your kid is before you're putting in all that maternal investment. You need to know who you're cooperating with, who you're aggressive with, all of that. And very importantly, you need to know who to mate with based on relatedness. Now, this one seems to have an obvious sort of punchline, which is you need to know somebody's a relative, so don't mate with them. Make sure you don't. But this brings up a problem in the field. So, why don't you want to mate with a close relative? Because of inbreeding, because mutations that are heterozygotic will now become homozygotic. Hopefully everyone who needed to catch up on terms last week now will know that contrast. When inbreeding happens, a lot of mutations become homozygotic. They appear. You don't want to have inbreeding. So avoid that. However, on the other hand, we've got kin selection, where the whole notion is the closer the relative, the more you cooperate with them. Why don't you cooperate by having kids together? So the forces of kin selection suggest you should want to be mating with close relatives. The forces of avoiding inbreeding mutation says breed with non-relatives. How are you going to balance this out? And people did all sorts of theoretical modeling about how you balance these as a function of how cooperative you would be with your close relative mate and how often the mutations are likely to arise, blah, 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 and came up with this great theoretical finding suggesting that the optimal way to balance kin selection forces and avoiding inbreeding forces is to mate with your third cousin. Okay, so that's what the models produced. And remarkably, people went and studied all sorts of wild populations. This was first observed in birds, and birds preferentially mate with third cousins. Whoa, what's that about? Well, first thing, right off, you could say, well, birds sort of live near each other, they grow up and they set up next door, so you're surrounded by relatives, so you don't have to go far. Even in bird species where there's dispersal, birds seek out third cousins to mate with them. Next issue is, if any of this evolution stuff makes sense, is that actually an adaptive strategy for these birds? And yes, the most likely offspring to survive are offspring of third cousin matings. So all sorts of other examples of this out there, which brings us to humans. And is there any evidence for this moderate degree of inbreeding, moderate degree of, I don't know if that, no, actually, I don't know if that legally counts as incest in what country or state, but is there any evidence in humans? And yes, there is. The world's greatest genealogical records can be found in Iceland because everybody knows when Iceland started. Nobody was there before people got there. And it's the descendants of a relatively small founder population and all sorts of interesting genetic stuff that we'll be hearing about was worked out with Icelandic populations. And there's amazing genealogy, and researchers were able to go back and identify third cousin marriages and second cousin and total strangers and degree of relatedness over centuries worth of census data. And what they saw was the most reproductively viable strategy over Icelandic history was marrying a third cousin. That was the version that was most likely to produce an offspring who survived until adulthood. So you see even evidence of this in humans. Okay, what you also see in terms of why care who you're related to, you see evidence that like lots of species care about it a ton and use fancy cognition to sort this out. For example, baboons. Baboons, this was a wonderful study done by this couple at UPenn, Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth, with baboons, different baboons than mine, not as lovely of baboons, but with baboons nonetheless, showing something quite amazing. Okay, these are the two who pioneered sticking a speaker in the bushes and you've got a whole library of vocalizations. And here's what they did in this study. They played the vocalization of a high-ranking individual, a high-ranking female, and a vocalization of a low-ranking female. And some of the time, it made perfect sense. The speaker gave the sound of the high-ranking female, giving a dominance vocalization, and the low-ranking one giving a subordinates vocalization. Okay, whatever. Nobody pays any attention. That's just the usual, like rubbing somebody's nose in it. That's just everyday business. Then they engineered the recording to give a dominance reversal so that the lower ranking female was giving the dominance vocalization and the higher ranking one was giving a subordination one. This is like, I don't know, Elon Musk panhandling some person, street person, or whatever, a reversal like that, which is important. That means something is majorly up. So, first off, baboons stopped what they were doing when they heard a reversal, showing they understand hierarchy and they understand, whoa, what's going on? Number 3 just dominated number 2. We're going to have to rethink this whole thing here. But they did it under 2 circumstances. In one version of this study, the reversal was taking place within a family. In the other case, it was a reversal between 2 different families. And what you saw was, if it was in a family, yeah, baboons paid more attention, but then they went back to what they were doing. If it was between families, they stopped what they were doing much longer. What's that about? You hear a dominance reversal in a family and you say, whatever, this happened, this families are crazy, you should have seen mine Thanksgiving, yeah, okay, so they get these squabbles and suddenly the grandkid is pushing around the grandparent, but, whatever, families, can't live with them, can't live. But if it's a dominance reversal between families, they're not of the same family. That's not just like mother-daughter squabbling. This is significant, showing baboons not only understand kinship and understand rank, but can isolate the two by having them as independent variables. Then something even cooler that they showed was you do the exact same study with the baboons living next door, playing this group's vocalizations, and you see the same thing. Baboons are even paying attention to dominant stuff going on in the next troop and kinship stuff in the next troop. So you see this stuff is really important to all sorts of these folks. So, of course, this raises the question of how you do it. How do different organisms figure out who's related to them and what degree of relatedness? Now, we already heard about the simplest example of how do 2 cells figure out whether or not they're relatives. And the other day, we heard that in terms of sperm. Sperm from the same individual, they will interact. They have surface proteins that will dock with each other, and now they swim faster. Sperm between, say, from one individual and his full brother will have docking, but not quite as strong. And then they'll swim, but not quite as avidly, like binding to like. And this is this theme that we've got. Okay, so here we have a cell. And I'm thrilled to be able to have drawn our first schematic of DNA. So we are off and running for the quarter here. And every cell out there has surface proteins. Surface proteins that are pumps, that are transporters, that are channels, all of that. But some surface proteins that do absolutely nothing other than give the signature of the individual. And in us, as we will hear about, we've got surface proteins that have individual signatures, the same one on every single one of our cells. And you see this with single cells. So you have some sort of surface protein here. This will not be visible. And the main thing about it is it's got to be really distinctive. It's got to be distinctive enough so that you are identifiable and so that your close relative has one that's kind of the same. And who knows what shape molecules you're going to wind up getting for surface receptors. So like binding to like. What's that about? Here we see, look at this dramatic electron micrograph photo, and what we see here, magnified 11 zillion times, are two pieces of Velcro. And we see like binding to like sort of recognition there, and that's what's going on in these cases here. And we see that in terms of back to last week, those bacteria that come from two different clonal lines, they're not related to each other, and they've got to decide, am I going to cooperate with this one or not? And they do it with the surface protein stuff. They do it with the same in the sperm cells, all of that. This is easy to do. This is telling you, like, this is who I should connect, this is who I should cooperate with, this is whom I should form a stalk or a fruiting body with, stuff from last week. This is how you do it. This is how you do it, distinguishing between, say, you and a complete stranger, or between a very close relative and a complete stranger. How do you get gradations of relatedness out of this? What we see here is a very simplified version and distorted version, but it's got to work something like this. Okay, so you have 4 different genes that code for surface receptors, surface proteins that serve no purpose other than being party or signature. And thus they stick these proteins on the surface and all of that, and along comes somebody who's got the same 4 genes. Wow, a close relative, they're almost close, and you get the docking, you get the Velcro stuff, or you get whatever it is that's needed to signal this is a close relative. This is as close as you can get. This is complete match here. And in terms of adhesion between cells, what that means is this will form very powerful Velcroing. Now, let's consider instead a sibling of the first individual, this first individual with their 4 genes there. And this sibling, who shares only half their genes, matches on this one and this one, but not the other 2, 50% shared genes. And what you have is they bind, but not quite as strong as in the top position. Half sibling. Now we're down to only 1 shared gene here, and the others are different variants. So they bind, but and you could see by having gradations of the avidity, the affinity with which 2 cells glue to each other, you can get gradations of relatedness and cooperation built around that. Good. So that's how you do it on the level of single cells. And this is actually a motif that's going to pop up all over the place because this is a whole lot of what we're doing with our immune systems and animals who know relatives instinctively. As we're going to see in the ethology lecture, instinctual is a very loaded term because it's been used in pretty distorted pseudoscience ways, lots of that. But innate, instinctual, you don't need to learn who your relative is. You know already who it is. How do you show this? You take two sibling rats, full siblings who just happen to come from different litters, from the same mating pair. They've never seen each other, they're different ages, all of that, and put them together, and they will differentiate in their interactions than they would with strangers. Put in a half sibling with the same mother but a different father from a different litter, and you will get affiliative behavior between them, but not as much for the full sibling, and so we're down the line. They have never seen each other before. No learning whatsoever. So what's the standard way this is done? In lots of species, pheromones, airborne odorants. You smell each other. You smell each other and gain all sorts of information. By the second half of the course, we're going to be looking at pheromones carry all sorts of reproductive information about if you're stressed or happy or all of that. And we will see as a great topic that there's good but not slam dunk evidence for this going on in humans. But for the moment, we've got pheromones, odors that carry individual signatures. How do you do this? It's obvious. It's the same sort of deal again, which is you've got to have odor receptors, and you've got to have some sort of odorant pheromone that comes floating along, and this has a template that's perfect for smelling yourself. Those of you who smell your armpits regularly, you will have binding here with the greatest affinity, the greatest avidity, and then a close relative will have something that's almost in kind of bind in there, and a distant relative barely, and we know that drill by now. So pheromones do this. It turns out they do it in a pretty interesting way, because, olfaction is important. In us, we devote 3% of our brain to the olfactory system. Rodents devote 40% of their brain to it. So odors are very big for them. So how can you tell that this is a special domain, which it turns out to be a special domain of social communication with pheromones? This isn't just about telling the difference between the smell of chocolate or rotten cheese or who knows what, but that is in a social realm. Oxytocin and vasopressin. These are two hormones. We're going to learn all about them, but nonetheless, what you see is neurons in the olfactory system, if they're not getting bathed in oxytocin or vasopressin, it depends on the species, depends on which sex, all of that, you got an olfactory problem. You don't lose your sense of smell, a la people getting COVID. You don't have an anosmia. You're still able to, for example, learn to smell the difference between two arbitrary odors. You, a rodent, you're able to do this. But if this system is not working, you don't recognize individuals by odor. You don't recognize degrees of relatedness by odor. You get something that is called social anosmia. And what's going on here is you don't have an olfactory problem. You have a problem with the olfactory system that cares about relationships and relatedness and all that sort of thing. And these are done with like fancy molecular studies where you do things like you knock out the gene for the oxytocin receptor. You knock out the gene for it only in the olfactory system, or you knock out the gene that codes for vasopressin or vasopressin receptor. These are all sort of standard tools. If this is unfamiliar stuff to you, you are a prime candidate for the catch-up section this week, and this is going to be lots of the rest of this week on that sort of stuff. Okay, so we have olfaction, pheromonal cues, and what we see here is it's not just learning an odor. You didn't need to learn that one. There's no learning involved in these innate systems. You've just proved it with the siblings from two different litters, and it's telling you something about pheromone signatures is accomplishing this. So how do you accomplish this? What we have is the olfactory system, the pheromone system, has piggybacked onto another system that we have, we mammals, we vertebrates. Another system that we have that generates individual signatures, the immune system. Every cell in your body has a distinctive signature protein on its surface, or many copies of it. And this says, this is a me cell. This proves it's for me. And every cell has the exact same signature peptide, signature protein on it. And that's great. Why do you care about this? Because the key thing that the immune system does for a living is tell the difference between you and something invasive, and does mean stuff to invasive things and leaves the you parts alone. The immune system has to be able to recognize self markers, surface markers, and no, don't attack them, and attack any cell, any bacteria, any pathogen, any whatever that is in there that has a different, an alien surface signature on it. So your immune system does that for a living, and it can screw up enormously every now and then and mess up and consider some surface protein, signature proteins that come from you. It messes up and accidentally decides it's not really part of you and attacks those cells. And this is what's termed an autoimmune disease. You've got multiple sclerosis, where it's an attack on the myelin cells and neurons. If you're not familiar with that term, don't panic. Doesn't matter. Rheumatoid arthritis, all sorts of these. And what you've got is the immune system screws up. But most of the time, they're doing perfectly fine. How do you generate a surface protein, a signature protein, a self protein that's going to be unlike that of anybody else on Earth? And what you have is a whole cluster of genes. Don't worry about these details. Don't write it down. These genes are part of what is called the major histocompatibility complex. Later this week, we're going to see in some circumstances, a piece of DNA will pick up and move to someplace else in the genome. We're going to hear all about that. And the genes coding in this major histocompatibility complex neighborhood are the most transposable bits of DNA we have in our genome. And what happens is, around the time that you need to generate a surface protein marker, right around when you're a fertilized egg, you do this shuffling, moving around different pieces of these genes, and you come up with a completely novel surface protein. And we will see how that's done later this week. Okay, so you've got a distinct surface protein going there. But what's that have to do with pheromones? You wind up seeing that same exact surface protein that's now attached to every one of your cells can also become soluble, can also become airborne, winds up in your saliva, winds up in your armpits, winds up being the signature, the pheromone signature that says, this is you. And with these rodents that could do this innate recognition stuff, what you see is the same deal there, that the closer the relative, the more similar the surface the more similar the pheromone is. And we've got that goodness of fit model. Fit in very well. This is a close relative, fit in sort of well, fit in just a little bit, and gradations of relatedness. If you take a neuroscience class, if you took a neuroscience class ever since the pyramids were built, you would have been taught a certain piece of dogma, which is, by the time you get an adult brain, you don't make new neurons. Whatever you have as a kid, that's it. All you can do is lose them by like drinking too much or whatever, but you don't make new neurons in the adult brain. And this should be a movie someday. In the 1960s, first evidence, this guy crying out in the wilderness, along with David Sloan Wilson for last week, this guy named Joseph Altman, who started getting evidence that no, in fact, you do get new neurons in the adult brain. There's evidence, he was reporting, for adult neurogenesis. And people thought this was totally asinine. He was at MIT at the time. He failed to get tenure as a result. He was crushed by what is now a very senior, very august old boy figure in the field who said this can't possibly be, and went out of his way to make sure that his career was ruined. And he spent his career at Purdue University. Soon after, a second person found evidence, and everyone said that's ridiculous, and he was driven out of science altogether, and I believe he wound up driving limousines for airport pickups. In any case, he fled from science. Decades went by, and a whole dramatic story as to how it happened, and by the 1990s, the hottest topic in neuroscience was adult neurogenesis. It turns out the adult brain does make neurons, sometimes in some places. Two areas that were critical. One is the hippocampus. If you know neuro stuff, learning and memory, we're not going to be paying too much attention to this in the course, but hippocampus gets new neurons when you are stimulated, environmentally enriched, things of that sort, and those new neurons play a role in learning new things. So that's cool. And then all along, this bizarre second place in the nervous system also had adult neurogenesis, the olfactory bulb, the olfactory system. And like 99% of the research on adult neurogenesis was on the hippocampus because, like, who cares about odors and the olfactory bulb? It's kind of weird and it's just sticking to the top of your nose and it doesn't do exciting. And then in 2003, there was this really interesting paper in Science. And what it showed was when a female rat becomes pregnant, prolactin levels rise over the course of her pregnancy. Prolactin, hormone, we will hear much about it. Prolactin supports maternal physiology. It is prolactational. What everybody knew is it supports milk production and does all sorts of interesting stuff as well. And what was prolactin doing in the olfactory bulbs? Levels of it in the bloodstream rising over pregnancy, and thus more of it getting into the neurons in the olfactory bulb. And what does prolactin do there? It stimulates neurogenesis. So that over the course of pregnancy, a female rat is completely renovating her whole olfactory system so that she's got spanking new receptors fresh out of the box right around the time that she gives birth. What's that about? And the immediate speculation was, well, that's so she can really, really effectively learn the smell of her offspring. And that's exactly what it's about. All sorts of research since then. It's shown male pheromones plus the pregnancy rise in prolactin is what triggers this neurogenesis, make new neurons there. And if the female doesn't do that, prolactin-mediated neurogenesis in the olfactory bulb, she becomes socially anosmic to the smell of her pups. She never learns their smell. How do you show this? All sorts of fancy lab techniques. You could just use a drug that drives down prolactin levels during pregnancy. Well, that's nice, but that's not very specific. You can use techniques to block neurogenesis in the adult brain, but you see something as that big as the olfactory bulb or what's happening in the hippocampus. Ooh, you come up with some molecular technique to knock out prolactin receptors in the olfactory bulb, and females at that point don't learn the smell of their offspring. So this shows this whole system driven by the need to be able to recognize your kid really, really well so you're not making a mistake and nursing the wrong individual, because seconds after your kids were born, you imprinted on their smell. You had a wonderful new olfactory system all set to do that. Two interesting elaborations. First one, there are closely related rodent species, where one is a pair bonder, the other is a tournament species, and that's perfect comparisons. So you do some of these rodent comparisons, and in pair bonding species, some of the same thing happens in the olfactory bulb of the soon-to-be fathers. So it is not sex specific. It's not as dramatic there. Does that happen in us? I don't think anybody knows at this point. Second interesting implication, insofar as this happens in humans, and that's still not clear, but insofar as it does, okay, think about it. So you spend your pregnancy with like your whole olfactory system being screwy. You're like doing programmed cell death of the olfactory receptor cells that are already there, and you're transporting in new ones that gotta get born, and then they gotta wire up, and you make mistakes with the wiring, so you gotta get rid of those, and this whole like thing that goes, you spend your whole pregnancy with your olfactory system all crazy and screwed up and undergoing renovations. No wonder you have all sorts of weird olfactory sensitivities during pregnancy. No wonder certain foods suddenly taste terrible, other ones are more appealing than anything you have ever had. Morning sickness, nausea, weird food aversions, weird food attractions. People forever have been coming up with just so stories, adaptationist stories. Why should you develop an aversion to this food during pregnancy? Well, because it's well known that this pathogen can get into this food, and if you eat it, it can make you sick and damage the baby, and why should you? Except the next person over has a completely different aversion. But this was a realm where for decades people went wild with a spandrel. Last week's term, a spandrel. Ooh, why do we get these weird olfactory things during pregnancy? Oh, it's to keep us from consuming toxins and all of that. It must be that over the course of the, and it could very well be a complete spandrel there. And what it is instead is you're doing this big renovation project where you have innate recognition. But then there's the world of where you need to get a sensory cue that is more interesting, more subtle than the pheromones that we just heard about, and a sensory cue that you imprint on. You're a female, and you're trying to figure out, like, here's a whole bunch of kids, which one of them did you just give birth to? Because right after you gave birth, your offspring goat has jumped up and joined a whole other bunch of newborn goats. And one of the ways of doing that is right after your kid was born, you sniffed around that kid a whole lot, and you learn to recognize them, not just because of these major histocompatibility signature stuff, but because this is the kid who smells of your amniotic fluid. This is the kid who smells of your vaginal fluids. This is the kid who you licked early on, who smells of your saliva, and forever after, which kid is mine? Oh, that kid smells like my saliva. Ooh, and my amniotic fluid as well. That must be my kid. You see this? My wife and I were watching this irresistible video last night of a horse that died in pregnancy or just after delivering, and another horse. They fostered the newborn horse cult, the newborn little horse to the other female, and we saw that they had to facilitate her nursing from her and making sure all the people around, making sure the foster mother didn't kick the kid, and she spent like hours licking every inch of the kid and then accepted the kid because this must be my kid. Forever after, this is going to be my kid because this kid smells of my saliva. This kid smells of my milk, having cues that way. So how can you show this is actually happening? And these were studies done back when with goats doing a truly inspired study where what you do is you get two newborn goats and you quickly wash them like crazy. You scrub them down and you wash them with goat deodorants or whatever. And then you get amniotic fluids from the other mothers and you smear the kid all over it, and who acts maternal to the kid suddenly switches. That's showing that that's one of the cues, that is the cue going on in that case. So you could be a researcher who gets to smear amniotic fluid all over baby goats and discover this is how you recognize who your kid is. And this then paves the way for second order learning of who your kid is. or who a relative is. Ooh, this kid smells like mom. This must be my sibling. Ooh, this kid smells like mom's milk or whatever. This kid of second order people doing those exact same sort of cross-fostering studies to show that this is going on. Then we enter the most interesting realm of all. This bacteria just knows who it's related to, and Velcro just knows another piece of Velcro from the same company and doesn't have a different shape to Velcro things and thus isn't a close relative Velcro, all of that. But then you get to the species that have to think about it, that have to use cognitive strategies in order to figure out if this is a relative or not. So, right off the bat, you would expect we have entered primate land, and we have indeed, but we've also entered the land of other very smart social beasts out there, and cetaceans and elephants and all of that, who need to think about who's related to them. And how can you tell they are thinking about it rather than this is innate, this is automatic, this is imprinted, this is, and we will get to what the word imprinted means in more detail in the ethology lecture. How do you tell there's actual cognition going on? Because they make mistakes now and then. That tells you a ton about this stuff. Back to that baboon phenomenon of males kidnapping. That low-ranking guy is about to be trounced by a high-ranking, and what does he do? He grabs the high-ranking guy's most likely kid and mess with me, and your kid gets it, and all of that. And then every now and then, you see they're not doing it innately. They've got to think about it. Because years ago, I saw this once with this low-ranking baboon or middle-ranking who was about to get trounced, exactly a circumstance where he should be doing some kidnapping because here comes the alpha male and all. And our middle-ranking guy panics and grabs a kid, and it's almost certainly his kid. He almost certainly grabs the wrong kid, and we say, oh my God, what is that? And you could kind of see the flash bulb goes off in his head of like, wait a second, who is this? And then like a second before he gets attacked, he tosses his kid clear, and yeah, you're thinking about it in some species. And the evidence is when you don't think very effectively or accurately when you make a mistake. So we would think that this is just fancy smart species. You see cognitive strategies in birds as well, and sheep as well. How can you show this with sheep? You take a sheep and you splotch some sort of like blue paint on its side, and then you take another sheep and you splotch blue paint on its side, and they start acting in an affiliative manner. And especially if you have splotched it on one of their mothers, they're thinking, whoa, I never knew I had a blue splotch, and look over and they see it there and they see one of them and say, oh, I guess this is a relative. This is sort of doing greenbeard. This is doing blue splotchism in a way for showing that in these species, they're thinking about it. They're thinking, whoa, what's this blue splotchness business about? You can see other cognitive strategies going in there. How do you know who's your kid? I remember giving birth to them. This is very different from 3 seconds after I gave birth to them, I imprinted on their olfactory signature for the rest of my life and now have it in there unmovably. I remember, no, this is the kid. I'd recognize that kid anywhere. That's the kid I gave birth to. A cognitive strategy like this of thinking, what we've just entered here is a realm of animals recognizing each other by appearance. And this is completely common. Okay, so now we see it can get even more complicated in terms of cognitive strategy. I mated with that female, and she had a kid, so it must be mine. How do we know that that is a cognitive strategy? Once again, when it screws up, when there's a mistake. And we saw a great example of that last week with competitive infanticide. that whole thing. Here comes a new male, you're a langur monkey. He's going to be infanticidal. He's going to kill your kid when you give birth. You're pregnant, all of that. And what is that great evolved strategy that we mentioned where the pregnant females will go into pseudo-estrus, pseudo-heat, pseudo-ovulation. They're not ovulating, they're pregnant, but they have all of the external signs of it. And the stupid male mates with her, and then 3 hours later she gives birth, and he thinks it's his kid, so he's not infanticidal. Oh, it's a cognitive strategy. It's not a very effective one there in that case, because the guy gets fooled. So this gives rise to some totally interesting studies that were done. This was out of a group from Princeton and Duke a few years ago with a different population of baboons. And these were, once again, these like gangly, unattractive yellow baboons, as opposed to the beautiful olive baboons found in my research site. But in any case, this was a study of baboons looking at something that couldn't possibly happen. They're a tournament species. You saw from the skulls the other day massive sexual dimorphism in size, massive dimorphism in terms of secondary sexual these are teeth, secondary characteristics, dimorphism in lifespan. A male baboon lives to be like 12 to 15. A female often makes 20 or more. All of they're like textbook tournament species, and male baboons will mate with anyone who's willing to mate with them. So this is the last species on Earth in which you would see male parental care, paternalism. What would paternalism look like in a baboon, this hypothetical behavior that can't possibly exist? You're not nursing the kid, but there's a lion pops up and you grab your kid and carry him up to a tree to be safe. Your kid's in a fight and you defend them. Your kid, all sorts of circumstances where you can see evidence of paternal behavior. And often, most helpfully, that you will sit with the kid while mom, who is still like a little bit lightheaded from giving birth, gets to actually go and forage for a bit. And we will see some of the implications of that. So in theory, you're not supposed to see any of these behaviors. And this was a study showing that, in fact, you do get some degree of paternal behavior given by male baboons. So, of course, we've now got a how do you recognize a relative question. Who are you being paternal to? And this study showed something fascinating. One thing you could see, people already knew that sometimes you get paternalism in male baboons in a very rare circumstance. You male baboon, you are the only one who mates with this female during the cycle in which she conceives. You're the only one because you stayed awake around the clock for days around when she was ovulating and made sure nobody else got around. And we'll hear plenty about that as a reproductive strategy in the sex lectures. But you're the only one who mated with her, to your knowledge, who mated with her, and thus a high degree of paternal behavior once the mother is giving birth to the kid. And you will see this, and where it's most common, I saw this once, is where you get an adolescent female who's just having her very first cycles, and she's presenting to big males all over the place, and they're completely disinterested, almost certainly because she's not pumping out much pheromones yet. Big picture, almost certainly because with baboons, sort of your first half dozen cycles or so are usually not fertile. You're not ovulating yet. So she was getting nowhere with the big guys. And then there was this other like middle school male who was just pining away for her, and they wound up having a consortship. And because nobody else was interested, no other male bothered to toss him out, so they stayed together around the clock for 4 or 5 days of mating, and unexpectedly beating the peri-adolescent ovulatory odds. She got pregnant, she gave birth to a kid, and the father, because almost certainly he was extremely paternal to the kid and defended him in all sorts of fights and things like that for years afterward. Okay, but that's a rare case. It's not often because baboons have a polygamous, polyandrous mating system, any given female during her cycle is likely to have mated with a whole bunch of different males. So, how do male baboons figure out then who their kid is likely to be? Likely to be. They do probabilities. When female baboons are in estrus, when all primates are in estrus except for humans, stay tuned for later in the course, but what you have is external signs of ovulation that in the day or two before ovulation become more dramatic and are at their peak at the time of ovulation and go down afterward. In most female primates, it is a swelling of the tissue around the vagina. It is estrogen driven. It is water retention there that does that. So you can tell who's at the peak of her cycle. And what male baboons do, as shown in the study, is I am likely to take care of this kid, or I'm going to take care of this kid if I was the one with her on her peak cycling day. I was the one who was with her the majority of the time in her cycle. They do probabilistic stuff, which is amazing that they're smart enough for that. And as we've already known, they nonetheless can make mistakes. But then an additional thing, which is they then said, okay, let's get some comparisons. They were looking at who a male would come to the aid of in a fight when two little kids were having a tussling or whatever. And they were defending the kid who was most likely to be theirs based on them having done most of the mating with the female at her peak of her cycle, and they collect fecal samples and do DNA analysis, and the males are right. The males are actually quite accurate with it. So now you get a circumstance where there's a fight. This is like a once in a lifetime. You get a fight between two kids, and this male mated with both mothers. Mated with both mothers at the peak of her cycle. Who's he going to defend? As it turned out, only one of them was related to him. This one, he turned out to be the father, and this one not. And in a few other cases of that, nonetheless, he still showed preferential defense of the kid who was actually related to him. This was not cognitive. What was this about? And the best evidence is you can recognize who's related to who. You recognize kinship and things like that. And baboons know what their families look like. And you spend a week looking at baboons and you'll know what families look like and all of that. So they're doing a mixture of, let's see, I was with both of these females at the peaks of their cycle, but this is the only one who looks like me. And you would note implicit in that is you got to kind of know what you look like, and you got to be aware that there's a me. And by the time you get to primates, stuff like that is commonplace. Okay, so you get to really smart species, and they can do this incredible probabilistic stuff and probably Bayesian analyses as to who's their kid and all that sort of. So this is a very, very abstract, demanding thing for an animal to be able to do. You only see it in primates. No, it turns out you see it in fish as well. This was a study done with sunfish who are pair bonding. We'll eventually hear they're not quite as pair bonding as you think, but they're pair bonding. And you put a female and a male sunfish in a tank, and it's the two of them there, and they form their pair bond. And once the female gives birth, the father is highly attentive to the eggs. I don't quite know what you do to take care of fish eggs when you're the father. But once the kids are born, you're very paternal, and he invests a lot of energy into the well-being of the offspring. Now, what you have instead are two variations on this. Now, put another little tank inside this tank. And inside this tank is another male. And now you take the female and put her in there. And what does this poor guy have to do? What does he do? He has to watch them mate. And then she comes back, and eventually when the eggs come out and the babies and all that, he's not as paternal because he knows in some cognitive manner fish can do this. But now showing a probabilistic thing. You put another male in the tank inside this inner tank in there. So he, in fact, cannot mate with the female. It's absolutely not possible, but he's just there for days. And this guy sitting here, our guy, well, he never quite sees her mate with him. And he doesn't understand glass and fish tanks and all of that and how they work, but he knows, who knows, maybe at some point I was looking out the glass on the other side looking for Nemo or something, and maybe she mated with him. You've just introduced probability into the relationship there. And just as with the baboons, you see a lower degree of male paternal behavior. So even fish can do something resembling cognitive strategies. Oh my God, how can fish do that? Stay tuned for the ethology lectures when we will be seeing just how much cognition is going on in animals where you'd never think it's happening and where we would never be able to recognize it because they've got a sensory world that's very different from ours. Okay, so great. So we've got surface marker, like binding to like, all sorts of stuff built on that, from single cell organisms recognizing relatives to using pheromone signatures to doing that. We've got imprinting strategies. Ooh, that kid smells just like my vaginal fluids. That must be my child. I think I'll nurse this kid. To cognitive strategies in other species. So, what about humans? Where do humans come into this? Let me just check the time. Where do humans come in? Obviously, we're like smart. We're primates. We're cognitive and masters. We can think about it. We can think about it. First off, we are really good at recognizing individuals. And in fact, primates have a specialized part of the cortex called the fusiform cortex. And no surprise, we humans is proportionally bigger in us than in any other primates. Fusiform cortex recognizes faces. It recognizes different categories. It files away this face versus that face. It keeps track of faces. The human brain is set up to be highly individuated in its social behavior. So we see a great starting point. So just use your fusiform cortex and you'll be able to know who a relative is once you think about it. Two interesting elaborations on the fusiform cortex. One, which is a bit of a side note, the fusiform did not evolve in order to recognize faces, or the fusiform does not specialize in recognizing faces. What it evolved for, what it specializes in, is recognizing individual examples in categories that matter to you. Okay, faces. But then you get somebody who's like some lunatic stamp collector, and their fusiform cortex will activate in response to different types of stamps that they spend their waking hours dreaming of. You're a sports car fanatic, and the fusiform will respond. It just responds to whatever category is really, really important to you. And it just happens in, like most of us, and in other primates, it's faces. Next interesting thing about the fusiform, which we will get back to in great detail later in the course, which is in about 75% of people, when you look at the face of somebody of a different race, the fusiform doesn't activate as much as if you were looking at the face of someone of your own race. And we'll eventually be getting to whether race is even a scientifically relevant term, but what you see there is, ooh, some faces don't count as much as others. Also, in that people who share a diet with you tend to have the same body smells, tend to have the same food breakdown catabolites, the breakdown products in their sweat, saliva, things of that sort. So that could be a route for it as well. How do they do that? And this is like classic studies where the diaphragm is this great resonating thing so that mom's voice is resonating with the fetus, all of that. This gave rise to one of the great classic studies of all time showing fetal learning. Here's what was done. A bunch of pregnant women were volunteers, and what they did was either they spent like 3 hours a day during their pregnancy reading The Cat in the Hat out loud, or They spent 3 hours reading a collection of other random kids' books where the same level of complexity of the wording, all of that. So now you've got your newborn, and you see if mom was reading Cat in the Hat while I was a fetus, you prefer hearing it. How do you figure out that this newborn prefers hearing it? And here's what you do. Totally elegant studies. You have headphones, and in one side is coming Cat in the Hat. On the other side is coming one of these other stories. And if this was a fetus who was hearing Cat in the Hat all the time, they orient more in that direction. They learned Cat in the Hat, and they also learned mom's voice. Do they prefer the voice of your mother reading Cat in the Hat? Turn this direction, or somebody else reading it, less so in that direction. So kids are learning their mother's voices. You may ask, what about the father's voice? And what is shown is fetuses do not learn father's voices anywhere near as effectively as mother's one. And I don't know how this was done, whether this was like fathers with like megaphones on mom's belly and shouting Cat in the Hat in there for 3 hours a day or something. But in any case, this is another version of recognition. So all of this makes sense. You think about it. You think about it built on historical stuff. You can recognize faces, you recognize voices, and then you think about it and hooray for us being a cognitive species. But then there's all sorts of unconscious, irrational rules that we have in our heads for who counts as a relative, who counts as an us versus a them, who counts as somebody who is a potential mating partner and somebody not. So the first example of this, the great example, was carried out by this anthropologist named Joseph Scheffer some decades ago, studying kids who were raised in kibbutzes in Israel. Kibbutzes, back when they were socialist enterprises, they were highly socialist, they were highly collectivist communal. Kids were raised in collectivist groups together, infants together, baths together, play together, the same group, the same age group, there for years and years from birth, all of that. And Scheffer noticed something interesting, which was not a statistical pattern in the population, not a sort of hint in the data. What he saw was in the entire history of kids being raised in kibbutz settings, nobody had ever married someone from their same peer group that they were taking baths with from the time they were like a year old or whatever. You never saw marriages between them. You saw incredibly close, and like you'd interview people like that and you would say, hey, you're like incredibly close with whoever, why don't you two guys get married? And they'd say, ugh, are you kidding? I mean, I love this person to bits, we've been there for each other, but like, they feel like a sibling to me. We have some sort of rule in our heads that individuals of the opposite sex who you spent a lot of intimate time in your first half dozen years of life or so never seem like a potential mate. And he was able to look at people who left kibbutzes or came in at various points, at what age kids had their shared exposure, and it was about the first half dozen years of life. Since then, something resembling the same has been shown with some indigenous Taiwanese population, with some ritual where you're married off to somebody when you're a baby, when you're both babies, and you grow up to the exact same finding. We've got some sort of unconscious rule in our heads that if you spent lots and lots of really close, intimate time with somebody back when you were counting your toes and counting their toes and all of that, what you see is you love them like crazy and they're close, but they don't feel like a potential mate. They feel like a sibling. So that's not rational. And what that also allows is a flip side of irrationality, the fact that we're not having automatic signatures, are the occasional cases of two individuals who wind up having an incestuous relationship because they didn't know they were related. If they were hamsters, they would instantly know exactly their degree of relatedness. No, we don't have that, and thus a stranger seems more plausible as a mating partner than somebody who you took bath with for years while you were an infant. All those years when you were an infant. So we've got unconscious stuff going on. We've got a rule like that. Then a study, very cool study, came out of a group of developmental psychologists at Harvard last year, and you've got a reading related to that. How do kids decide, looking at other people, forget figuring out who is my relative? How do you figure out with that who there should be a relative of each other? How do you figure that out first place? You give kids all sorts of tests, like here's a picture of a kid drinking out of a straw. And here's two other kids there. One of them is her friend. One of them is her sibling. Who is she going to share it with? And kids overwhelmingly say you share straws with relatives, not with unrelated kin. Or you flip the experiment around. This is with 5 to 7-year-olds. You say, okay, she's got this drink, and just now she shared her drink and straw with one of these other two, and now she's got it back, and she shared it with this one, and now she's got it back, and she's drinking. Who's her sister and who's her friend? The one she shared a straw with. That's a marker of close relatedness. And it turns out that's a rule that kids have in incredibly young ages. What they went on to show was in infants, there's a rule with that. If you share food, if you share utensils, if you share saliva, that's a marker of these are relatives. These are close. How do you do this? You're doing this with like a 12-month-old who has a limited vocabulary. How do you do this? You will have three puppets there, and you see puppets 1 and 2 share food utensils. They share an ice cream cone, something with licking and saliva and all of that, whereas the one in the middle does not do the same for this one. So the one in the middle has a problem. The puppet is trying to pick up something heavy, and you say to the kid, oh no, who's going to help them? And you see which direction the kid looks. And they look in the direction of the puppet who they think is the most logical one to come and help. Who's the one they look to? The one who shared a utensil with them. The one who shared saliva, an ice cream cone. And then you'll see in the handout, there's even, like, getting to the point, these great researchers where they got to have like puppets there, and either like you put your finger in your mouth and get some saliva and touch the head of this puppet and then go back there, or you stick your finger in the mouth of this puppet and get their saliva, their pseudo-saliva all over your finger and put it back there and do the same thing. Oh no, I need help lifting this. And who do 12-month-olds look at? They look at the one who you shared saliva with, who you shared utensils with, licking with, all of that. So that appears to be some sort of like cue that humans have for close relationships. So all of that's a way of saying we're not as accurate as hamsters. We're not as accurate as other rodents. Because you've set this kid up just now to believe that you and this Elmo that you stuck your finger in the mouth of are actually very close with each other. Yeah, we think we've got rules, we've got unconscious rules, we make mistakes, all of that. And that opens the way for one of the most interesting things about kinship and kin selection and greenbeards and group selection and anything in these realms having to do with humans. Given that we have to give conscious thought to this and unconscious biases about it, what that means is we're one of the only species, we're the only species, we're the species where it is easiest to manipulate an individual into thinking that this is a relative when it isn't, or that this one, there's no relationship when in fact they do. It's easy to manipulate us as to how related we feel to individuals, setting up this human phenomena of pseudo-kinship where thanks to cultural cues, green beards, all of that, you wind up feeling more related to somebody than you actually are, pseudo-kinship, or the opposite, where you see somebody as so different from you that they don't even count as human, pseudo-speciation. And we will see tons about that when we get to the aggression and cooperation lectures. But just as a first pass, every military on Earth that has ever known what it's doing, starting with the ancients or whatever, practice pseudo-kinship with soldiers when they're just getting trained. You get put together in your group and you get trained together and you eat together and you sleep in the same place and you're made miserable by extra push-ups together, and you wind up feeling like this is basically a group of close relatives. What's the term for in World War II? You wind up feeling like you are a band of brothers. And fascinating studies that showing because of the heterogeneity of America culturally, during World War II, there were circumstances where you would have a German American soldier right here fighting against a German Nazi soldier, this German American soldier right next to this Italian American soldier who they've been in basic training together, and the German American and the German could be cousins and often turned out to be. But who was the German American willing to give up his life for? The Italian American fighting next to him. Pseudo-kinship, and what military training is all about is brilliant different psychological mechanisms for making somebody feel so close to you that you would kill for them or you would give up your life for them. Pseudo-kinship. We see this in all sorts of other circumstances. After revolutions, people do pseudo-kinship stuff and they address each other as brother and sister, or this perfect stranger as comrade, and pseudo-kinship manipulation, psychological manipulations to make you feel more related to individuals than you actually are. A great example of that was after the French Revolution, when suddenly everybody was kin and fraternity and liberté and sorority or whatever. And what you have in French, I'm digging deep here into the 3 very unsuccessful years I had learning French in high school, is you've got 2 different classes, familiar and you can say you to somebody who's familiar to you, or you to a stranger, vous and tu, or tu and vous. I don't remember which. And there's a great story that when Tolstoy was a child, Tolstoy being raised in the aristocracy, not only had a great sense of privilege, but also was raised first in French because that was the cool thing at the time. And Tolstoy throwing a tantrum once because the nanny used the informal you word with him. How dare she? How dare this lowly peasant? So after the French Revolution, it was required that you address everyone with the informal family term for you. We're all siblings now. So pseudo-kinship. And that could produce great things out of people. That could produce awful things as to who you're willing to go along with and doing something awful. But then we've got the other side. The other side that is never anything other than horrific. The pseudo-speciation. And we see this over and over again. Any good dictator, any genocidal ideologue, anyone like that, what they know how to do, often with brilliant subtlety, is how to make the thems seem so different it hardly even counts as killing a human when you kill them. And we have endless historical examples of that. And we will get to that in a lot more detail when we get to the aggression lectures. But just to show an example of pseudo-speciation right now, there was an amazing example of this 6 months ago. 6 months ago, after October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel, and the aftermath as Israel geared up to invade Gaza, Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, made an address on television saying, remember the Amalekites and what they did to us. Remember them. Who are the Amalekites? The Amalekites were one of the regular old tribes that was constantly fighting with the Israelites in the Old Testament. They were like the Canaanites, and they were like the Philistines, and they were just yet another one of the stock player enemy troops. But they were special in terms of enemy tribes. They had done a sneak attack on the Israelites when the Israelites first left Egypt as they were coming into Sinai. The Amalekites, for no reason whatsoever, attacked them. Ooh, a sneak attack. And thus they were forever the great enemies of the Israelites in the Old Testament. But God gets fed up with them and gives word by way of the prophet Samuel that that's it. You are to destroy this tribe, the Amalekites. You are destroyed. Man, woman, child, destroy everyone, presumably destroy their hospitals. You destroy their animals too, kill their cows and their donkeys and their chickens and blow up their veterinary hospitals and kill every last one and kill all their and do all that. And the Israelites went about doing it. But Saul, king of Israel, did a bad move. He did this bro thing with the king of the Amalekites, King Agag, and decided to spare him. He also stole some of the goats and sheep as well and kept them for himself. But he left him. He allowed him to survive through this old boy king network. And what happens? What do you know? This guy reproduces, and 500 years later, they're back in large number. And throughout history, the Amalekites are the ones where kill every last one, because if you leave in one cancerous cell in there, it's going to grow back again. And here was Netanyahu citing them, citing not any old biblical enemy of the Israelites, not citing the Philistines and their Philistine, but citing the ones where God commanded you kill every last man, woman, child, because if you leave even one, they're going to come back. They're going to come back and be an existential threat again. Now, historians basically have found next to no evidence that there actually was a tribe of this name, so maybe made up, who knows what. But fortunately, all sorts of right-wing Orthodox Jewish scholars have weighed in, and at least in one right-wing settler yeshiva school, has weighed in with an analysis of how the Palestinians are the descendants of, once again, you left one person still alive, and here we are back all over again, whereas the much more progressive ones in that sort of camp say, no, 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 it's just a metaphor by now. Okay, we will stop at this point, and on Wednesday, we will now pick up with exactly where our bucket of thinking about evolution ends, which is saying, so it evolved and something or other happened with genes, and that's exactly where the bucket of the molecular genetic people start, saying, show me the genes. What do you mean you evolved the trait for this or that? Let's look at the actual workings of how genes code for behaviors or influence behaviors, and how genes relevant to that evolve over time.